The recording light was blinking, had been blinking for about 3 minutes. I kept staring at it like it owed me something. Archive Session 419, I said finally. Marcus Vale, UN Interstellar Liaison, speaking for the Concord Historical Record. I picked up my coffee. Cold. I drank it anyway. You want me to start from the beginning? Nobody ever means that. I set the cup down. Fine, the beginning. In 2041, humanity was drowning. Not in the poetic sense. Not in the way politicians used to say it on television to get votes. Actually drowning. The biosphere had been in collapse for 11 years. The oceans were wrong. The air was getting there. We had managed, through a combination of stubbornness and last-minute engineering, to build 3 colony ships. 3. For 8 billion people. The math was the kind that kept you awake at night and kept scientists drinking heavily before noon. I was 29 years old and working in Jakarta as a junior attaché for the UN Environmental Commission, which at that point was basically a group of very educated people writing very detailed reports about how bad everything was. I was good at my job. The reports were excellent. Nobody was saved by them. Then the Vilhari arrived. I was on the 14th floor of our commission building when the sky changed. No dramatic rumble, no alarm. The sky just went from hazy orange to something else, something that had no color name in any language I knew, and then there were ships. Not one. Not a fleet in the way we imagined fleets. Hundreds. Spread across the horizon like a second layer of clouds, but deliberate. Everything about them was deliberate. That was the first thing you learned about the Vilhari. They did not do anything by accident. They were tall. Every one of them stood at least 2 meters. Their skin shifted color along the jawline, something bioluminescent that I later learned was tied to emotional state, though reading it correctly took years of practice and 3 graduate-level courses I never finished. They smelled like ozone after rain and faintly like cinnamon. Not the grocery store kind. The real kind, the kind from the actual bark, sharp and a little medicinal. I noticed this the first time one of them stood close to me, and I kept noticing it for 12 years after. Some things you do not stop noticing. They spoke first through a translation array they had apparently prepared in advance, which told you everything you needed to know about how long they had been watching us before they introduced themselves. Their language, translated to English, came out slow, measured. Every sentence constructed the way an architect draws a load-bearing wall. The one who spoke first was their elder. Her name in Vilhari was something close to 17 syllables long. The translation, which she gave us herself without irony, was patience that outlasts stone. We called her elder, which she accepted. She had been accepting things humans did for a very long time before we knew she existed. She told us, in the measured and completely terrifying way of someone explaining something obvious to someone who should already know it, that they had identified the collapse trajectory of Earth's biosphere 4 years prior. They had debated the appropriate response. They had concluded that intervention was the correct action. They were here now to begin. A reporter in the front of the assembled crowd asked, through a microphone with a shaking hand, what the cost was. Elder looked at the reporter for a long time. The light along her jaw shifted to something pale and even. There is no cost, she said. You are drowning, we have rope. Nobody knew what to say to that. I wrote it in my notes and stared at it for 3 days afterward. They worked for 2 years. I use the word worked because there is no better one. They did not perform miracles. They did not wave their hands and fix everything. They brought materials, equipment, knowledge, and an understanding of ecological systems that made our best environmental scientists sit in conference rooms with their heads in their hands and whisper things like, "We were so close," and another 40 years, and we might have figured this out. They rebuilt atmospheric processors. They reseeded dead ocean zones with organisms engineered to survive the conditions we had created. They showed us water filtration methods that used a fraction of the energy our best systems required. They did all of this without once making us feel like we had earned it, because we had not earned it, and the Vilhari did not lie for the sake of comfort. By 2043, Earth was not healed, but it was no longer dying. By 2045, the colony ships had been repurposed as research vessels, because the emergency they were built for had been quietly, methodically removed. I was 33 years old and had been promoted 3 times, largely because I was one of 11 humans on the planet who had learned enough Velhari to hold a basic conversation without a translator present. It was not a skill I had planned for. It was the kind of skill that happened when you spent 18 months sitting in the back of every briefing, listening, because listening was the only useful thing you could do. They invited us into the Concord in 2047. The Concord was not an alliance the way we imagined alliances. It was not a treaty signed at a long table with flags. It was a living structure, 23 species across 11 star systems, operating under a framework of mutual recognition and shared responsibility that had been in development for, depending on which species you asked, somewhere between 8,000 and 40,000 years. It was the kind of institution that had footnotes older than human civilization. We joined as a protected member, junior status. The Concord's language for it was more generous, something that translated loosely as emerging voice, but the substance was clear enough. We were the newest and the smallest and the most recently rescued. We were at the table. We were not yet expected to carry anything. I told myself that was fine. We needed time. We had been nearly wiped out 6 years prior. You did not go from the edge of extinction to a seat at the interstellar table without a period of adjustment. I believed that for about 4 years. Then I learned to read the bioluminescence on a Velhari's jaw well enough to know what it meant when it went very, very still. It meant something was wrong. The signal came on a Thursday. I know it was a Thursday because I had been putting off a report that was due on Friday and had been using the coffee going cold as an excuse to keep not writing it. The signal broke into the Commission's communication channel at 14:32 station time. It was Velhari in origin. I recognized the carrier frequency. I did not recognize anything else about it. Velhari signals were organized the way their speech was organized. Layered, precise, built in a sequence that moved from context to content to conclusion. This signal had no context layer. It went straight to content, and the content was compressed in a way that suggested whoever sent it did not believe they had time for anything else. I ran it through the translation array twice because I thought I had made an error. I had not made an error. I sat in my chair for a moment. The recording light on my archive session was still blinking. The coffee was getting colder. The Velhari did not panic. I knew this the way I knew my own name at that point. 12 years of working alongside them, 12 years of watching them face supply crises and diplomatic failures and the ordinary catastrophes of interstellar coordination, and I had never once seen one of them compress a signal. I picked up the communication device. I put it back down. I picked up the cold coffee. I put that back down too. The signal had 4 words in it. 4 words and nothing else. No coordinates, no identification, no contextual layer. Nothing that the Velhari would ever omit unless they believed the situation had already moved past the point where context was useful. 4 words. They are already here. I stood up. I did not know who they were yet. I was going to find out very soon, and I was going to wish for a brief and honest moment that I had finished the report instead. The chamber on Concord Station Theta was built in a spiral, 23 sections, one for each member species, curving inward toward a central floor where speakers stood when they had something to say that all of them needed to hear. The architecture was Velhari in origin from the early days of the Concord, and it was designed so that every seat had the same sight line to the center. No position of advantage, no head of the table, everyone equal in distance from the truth. I had been in that chamber 41 times. I had found it beautiful the first time. By the 42nd time, I found it deeply uncomfortable in the way that beautiful things become uncomfortable when the news they frame is bad enough. I was the only human in the room with a vote. This was not unusual. We had one seat, the same as every other member. What was unusual was the quality of silence in the room when I walked in. 23 species. Some of them communicated through color shifts in their skin. Some of them used subsonic frequencies that I could feel in my back teeth but could not hear. Some of them were perfectly silent in every measurable way and still somehow managed to fill a room with the sensation of held breath. Every single one of them felt it that day. I took my seat. The Velhari elder was already standing at the center floor. She had not waited for the formal call to session. That alone told me more than the compressed signal had. She did not open with context. She opened with the casualty report from the Pelori system. I had seen numbers in reports before, large numbers, the kind that came with so many zeros that your brain stopped processing them as people and started processing them as data. 17 billion was not a number I had ever seen applied to a single event. It sat in the chamber like something physical, like furniture nobody wanted. The Rathka elder spoke the name with the specific neutrality of someone who had decided that the appropriate emotional response was a problem to solve later. I appreciated that. I was doing the same thing. She pulled up the engagement records. The Pelori system had been a conquered protectorate, a small Drevian colony whirled on the outer edge of the conquered's recognized territory. The Rathka had entered the system without a prior signal, without a demand, without any of the standard contact protocols that every spacefaring civilization, even the most aggressive ones, used at the opening of a conflict. They had simply arrived and begun. The engagement had lasted 9 hours. The Drevian defense fleet, which was not small, had been gone in the first 4. The colony infrastructure had followed. The planet's surface, which had supported life in comfortable conditions for 300 years of Drevian habitation, had followed that. 9 hours. I sat with that number. I was good at sitting with numbers. The Rathka did not show up on any conquered record before 6 months prior. They had appeared at the edge of known space as a signal anomaly, something the conquered's deep-range sensors flagged as unusual but not threatening. They had been placed in a monitoring category. Someone had assigned a team to study the anomaly. The team had filed 2 preliminary reports. The 3rd report had been due the week the Pelori system was erased. There was no team anymore. Elder finished speaking. The chamber was quiet again, a different quality of quiet now, the kind that came after information rather than before it. The Conquered's military representative, a Pelori general whose name translated to something like clear water over stone, stood and presented the engagement simulations his analysts had run over the preceding 72 hours. I appreciated the precision. Every simulation was labeled with its assumed parameters. Every outcome column was annotated. The Conquered was very good at presenting information clearly. It was one of the things I genuinely admired about it. The outcome column had not changed across any of the simulations. Every one of them ended the same way. The Rathka did not appear to have a maximum operational range. They did not appear to have a supply chain vulnerability. They did not negotiate. They did not take prisoners, territory, or resources. Whatever they wanted, it was not any of the things that other civilizations, even hostile ones, had historically wanted, which meant that every strategic framework the Conquered had ever developed for conflict resolution was essentially useless. I was taking notes. I had been taking notes for 30 seconds when I realized what I was writing was not going to help anyone and stopped. The Conquered had shields that could absorb impacts at a scale that made our best engineering look like a child's drawing. They had propulsion technology that folded space in ways I would never fully understand. Their energy weapons were precise enough to cut a single thread at a range of 10 kilometers. They were, by every metric that had mattered for the past 8,000 years of interstellar civilization, enormously powerful. The Rathka did not die from precision. I had not known that yet. I would. What I knew in the chamber, sitting in the spiral with 23 species and a column of identical outcomes, was that the conquered was afraid, not of losing, of not understanding the shape of the loss. There is a particular kind of fear that only comes when you face something that does not behave the way things are supposed to behave, and every species in that room, regardless of their form or their biology or the number of years their civilization had been operating, was feeling it in their own way. I recognized the feeling. Humanity had felt it for most of its history. We just had a different name for it. We called it Tuesday. Elder looked at me across the chamber floor. She did not signal to me. She did not use my name through the formal address system. She looked at me the way you look at someone when you need to say something that the formal systems are not built to carry. Marcus Vale, she said, we need to ask humanity something. The room went very still. I set my pen down. The Conquered's capabilities, she said, were developed over many thousands of years of contact with civilizations that could be reasoned with, negotiated with, or outmaneuvered through technological superiority. What we face now does not fit those categories. She paused. The light along her jaw was doing something I had never seen it do before. Not dark, not pale, shifting, like it could not settle. We have studied your history, she said. We have studied it carefully. Your species has faced extinction, resource failure, internal conflict, and external pressure at a frequency and scale that no other conquered member has experienced in recorded history. I waited. And your species, she said, has consistently, across every recorded instance, survived through a method we do not have a framework to replicate. What method? I asked. You absorb the damage, she said, and you keep moving. The chamber was very quiet. I thought about the colony ships. I thought about the casualty reports that had crossed my desk for 12 years. I thought about Yara Os, who I had met twice, who was currently commanding the human fleet's 2nd Division, and who had a way of going very still when she was deciding something that told you the decision was already made. You just had not been informed yet. I thought about what the Conquered was asking. I thought about the word rope. You want us to fight, I said. We want you to show us how, Elder said. I sat with that for a moment. There is something you should understand, I said, before we agree, before we do anything. She waited. When humans fight, I said, we do not fight the way you do. We do not fight to demonstrate capability or establish deterrence. When we decide the situation requires it, we fight to end it. The approach is not elegant. It is not precise. It works through a kind of arithmetic that you may find uncomfortable. Losses traded for gains, Elder said. Yes, we have calculated that. Calculating it, I said, is different from watching it. She looked at me for a long time. The light along her jaw settled, went steady. We understand, she said. She did not understand yet. I knew that. I said nothing about it. Get me Commander Osai on a secure line, I said, to no one in particular, to everyone in general. And someone find me coffee that is actually warm. Nobody laughed. That was fine. It was not a funny situation. It was just the only register I had left. Yara Os did not waste words. This was not a personality trait. It was a professional philosophy she had developed over 15 years of command in circumstances where every extra word was a second someone could have been using for something useful. When I reached her on the secure line, she was eating something from a tin container that looked like it had been heated once and not very well. She looked at me through the screen with the expression of someone who already knew what I was going to say and had already started planning around it. How bad, she said. Pylori system, I said. She stopped eating. I gave her the numbers, the timeline, the simulation outcomes. I gave her all of it in the order it mattered and skipped the parts that did not. She listened without interrupting, which was how I knew she was taking it seriously. Yara interrupted things that did not concern her, and went very quiet about things that did. The Rathka do not negotiate, I said. Nobody's tried hard enough, she said. Elders' people tried. A pause. Understood, Yara said. That word from Yara meant the conversation about alternatives was over. What do you need from me? I asked. Everything, she said, and 6 weeks. She got 4. I will not pretend that 4 weeks was enough time to prepare for what we were walking into. It was not. But Yara had a way of identifying which preparations were necessary, and which were the kind that made people feel better without making them more effective, and she cut the second category without hesitation. She kept the things that mattered. She dropped the things that did not. The result was a fleet that was not as large as anyone would have wanted, and not as equipped as anyone would have liked, but was crewed by people who knew exactly what they were there to do. The Concord supplied shielding upgrades. Their engineers worked alongside ours, and I will say this for the Concord. When they committed to something, they committed fully. The Velhari shield integration alone added a survival margin to our ships that our own engineers estimated would have taken 12 years to develop independently. The Pelori contributed targeting arrays. The Drevian, who had lost the most, and had the most specific kind of anger that comes from personal loss, rather than strategic calculation, contributed everything they had left and asked only to be told when it was done. I watched all of this from Theta Station. I attended briefings. I signed authorizations. I forwarded communications and wrote summaries and did all the things that a liaison was supposed to do, and in between all of those things I thought about what Elder had said. You absorb the damage and you keep moving. I thought about what it meant that she had said it like a compliment. The Rathka incursion into the Drevian corridor began 16 days after Yara's fleet completed its formation. They did not announce it. They appeared at the edge of the corridor the way they had appeared at the edge of the Pelori system, without warning, without signal, without any of the behavioral patterns the Concord's analysts had been hopping to identify. I was on the command deck of the carrier ship Macond when the alert came through. The Macond was not a warship. It was a diplomatic and coordination vessel, fast enough to stay out of the main engagement and equipped to process communication feeds from every ship in the fleet simultaneously. My job was to be the human face in the room, the person who could speak to both Yara's command and the Concord observers, the translator in every sense of the word. Yara's voice came through the command feed, calm, completely, almost unnervingly calm. All units, formation Delta, maintain spacing. Do not engage until I say engage. The Rathka moved into the corridor. They were not what I had expected, and I had spent 4 weeks trying to expect the right thing. The visual feed from the forward scouts showed vessels that were not elegant. They were massive, dense, built the way something is built when it has never had to worry about being hit because nothing it had ever faced could hit it effectively. They moved without formation, without the coordinated patterns that every other spacefaring military used, because they had never needed coordination. They were each individually enough. Yara waited. The Rathka advanced. Yara waited longer. The Concord observer beside me, a Velhari logistics coordinator named something that translated loosely as careful measure, leaned slightly toward my station. Commander Osa is not moving, he said. Not a question. Observation. She's waiting, I said. For what? For them to commit, I said. You want them all the way in before you close the formation. You want them thinking they have space to move through. Then you take the space. He looked at the feed. That requires absorbing the initial engagement. Yes, I said. He was quiet. The first Rathka weapons discharge lit up the forward edge of Yara's fleet. 3 ships took direct hits. One of them, the frigate Dunmore, went dark for 11 seconds before its emergency systems responded. Yara's voice. Pushing. The human fleet moved, not back, forward into the fire, which was so contrary to every tactical instinct the Concord's observers had been trained on. That careful measure actually made a sound beside me, something involuntary in a frequency just at the edge of my hearing. They did not expect us to go forward. The Rathka had never faced something that absorbed a hit and came forward anyway. Their formation, such as it was, had no doctrine for it. They had always fought things that, when struck, either retreated or stopped. We did neither. Yara's fleet folded into the Rathka advance like water finding cracks in stone. Not elegant, not precise, but effective in the specific way that pressure over time is always effective. 3 hours in, the Rathka formation had fractured. 5 hours in, they were responding to the engagement rather than dictating it, which was the first time in the campaign that any conquered force had achieved that. 8 hours in, they were withdrawing. Not defeated, withdrawing. It was not a victory in the way the conquered understood victories. No decisive strike, no surrender. Just a calculation on the Rathka side that continuing to press was no longer producing the outcomes they expected, and a withdrawal to reassess. We had made them reassess. That was everything. 11 human ships had not made it through. 11 ships, 943 crew. I had the numbers on my screen before the engagement feed had even cleared. Yara's after-action report came in 40 minutes later. I read it twice. Losses within projected parameters, requesting resupply and redeployment orders. Within projected parameters. I stared at that phrase for a long time. The Veilhari observer was quiet beside me. The bioluminescence along his jaw had gone to the pale. Even color I now knew meant something close to shock. She knew, he said. Before the engagement, she knew those ships would not come back. Yes, I said. And she went anyway. That is correct. He processed this. I watched him process it. There was something in his expression that I did not have a name for yet, and I was not sure I wanted one. Commander Osai is extraordinary, he said. Commander Osai is not unusual, I said. That is the part you need to understand. He looked at me. Among humans, I said, she is not exceptional for this. She is exceptional for many reasons, but not for this. He looked back at the cleared engagement feed. I think, he said slowly, that we did not fully understand what we were asking. No, I said, you did not. I said it without anger, without weight, just as a fact, the same way you state the temperature or the distance between 2 points. It was a fact, and it was only the beginning. 3 years into the war, I had developed a routine. Wake at 05:30. Spend 20 minutes convincing myself that what I needed was to get up and not to keep lying there doing math in my head about timelines and casualties, and the rate at which the Concord's political structure was shifting around humanity's expanding role. Fail at that for 10 of those 20 minutes. Get up anyway. Drink whatever the Mackin's galley was calling coffee, which bore a resemblance to actual coffee in the same way that a photograph of a fire resembles warmth. Review overnight communications. Attend 3 to 7 briefings, depending on the operational tempo. Write summaries. Sign authorizations. Avoid looking at the running casualty count on the left side of my screen for as long as I could manage, which by the 3rd year was rarely longer than 11 minutes. I had delivered 31 memorial addresses. I kept a template on my system. I hated myself for keeping it. I used it every time because the alternative was sitting down to write one from scratch, and I had tried that in the early days, and what came out of it was not appropriate for a public address. It was too honest. It named things that people who had sent those crew members out needed to believe were unnamed. The template was not dishonest. It honored the dead. It placed their sacrifice in the context of the larger effort. It was well constructed and had been reviewed by the Concord's communication team, and approved as culturally sensitive across 17 of the 23-member species. It was also the most hollow thing I had ever produced, and I produced it 31 times, and I will produce it more. The 32nd address was for a crew member named Callum Price, 24 years old, navigation officer aboard the frigate Endurance. He was from a small town outside of Bristol. His mother had sent a message through the casualty liaison office, not a formal communication, just a message, asking if I had known him personally. I had not. I replied anyway. I told her that her son had been part of something that was going to matter. I told her that in the specific way that a man who has used words professionally for 20 years tells a grieving mother something important, which is to say carefully and with great attention to what he does not say. I do not know if it helped. I know it did not help enough. The war had changed by the 3rd year, not in the way that wars change when one side is winning and the other is losing. The Rathka were not losing exactly. They were adapting. They had begun modifying their approach in response to human tactics, which was the first sign that they were capable of learning, which was both encouraging as a sign of possible future communication and deeply inconvenient as an immediate operational problem. Yara had adapted in response. The Conquered had adapted in response to Yara. The whole thing was evolving at a pace that would have been fascinating to study if I had not been inside it. The Conquered had also changed. This was the part I thought about most, lying in those 20 minutes of morning before I got up. In the first months, humanity's role had been understood as temporary, emergency mobilization. We would fight because the situation required it. The Rathka threat would be resolved, and then we would return to our position as the Conquered's junior member, a little more respected perhaps, a little further from the ward end of the spectrum. That understanding had quietly stopped being the operating assumption sometime around the end of the first year. Nobody had announced a change. Nobody had sat down with me and said, "Marcus, we are now thinking about this differently." It had happened the way most important changes happen, in accumulated small moments, in the way people started introducing me at briefings, in the language the Conquered's internal communications used when referring to humanity's forces, in the growing frequency of requests that were not emergency requests, but were simply the natural routing of military decisions toward the people who were making them effectively. Humanity had become the Conquered's blade. Not by agreement, by function. And functions, left long enough, become definitions. I was thinking about all of this when the formal communication arrived from the Conquered Security Council. I was in my office, which was a compartment on the Mackin that had been designated as my office because it had a door that closed, which was more than most people had. I was eating something from a tin. It was not good. I was not eating it because it was good. The communication was flagged for my eyes only, which on Conquered Station protocols meant it had been reviewed and approved at the Elder Council level before routing to me, which meant it was serious in the specific way that things are serious when very old and very deliberate people have sat with them long enough to be certain. I read it. I read it again. The Conquered Security Council was proposing a formal designation for humanity's role within the Conquered structure, not junior member, not emerging voice, not protected status. Martial arm. Permanent, codified. The species designated to bear the primary military burden of Conquered defense in perpetuity, in exchange for full resource access, territorial rights in 3 new systems, and an elevation of formal status to senior partnership level. It was, on paper, the best offer anyone had ever made humanity. It was also a definition. And definitions, once written into Conquered law, did not change quickly. The Conquered's legal framework had articles in it that predated human agriculture. Things that entered that framework did not leave on human timescales. I set the communication down, picked up the tin, put the tin down. There was a knock at the compartment door. Yara. She came in without waiting for me to say come in, which was normal. She had a tin of her own. She sat down across from me without being invited, which was also normal. She looked at the communication on my desk without asking what it was, and from the quality of her not asking, I understood she already knew. They sent it to you first, she said. Yes. Courtesy, she said, or strategy? Both, I said, probably. She ate something from her tin, made no expression about the quality of it. What are you going to do? She said. I have 48 hours to respond, I said. I am going to think. You've been thinking for 3 years, she said. That's what all that lying awake is. I looked at her. The compartments on this ship are not soundproof, she said, without apology. I was quiet for a moment. It is a very generous offer, I said. It is, she said. The resource access alone would change the reconstruction timeline for the Eastern Biosphere zones by 8 years. Yes, she said. The territorial rights would give us room for 6 new colony programs. I know. And the status elevation would mean that the next time something like this happens, nobody has to ask us. We are simply already at the table as equals. Yara put her tin down. She looked at me with the expression she used when she was about to say the thing that the whole conversation had actually been about. It is a box, Marcus, she said. A very nice box. I closed my eyes. Yes, I said. The question, she said, is whether we get in it because we chose to or because we ran out of room to stand anywhere else. She picked up her tin, stood, moved to the door. 48 hours, she said. Yes. Understood, she said. She left. I sat in the compartment for a while after that. The communication was still on the desk. The tin was still where I had left it. The coffee on the shelf had gone cold again, because it always did, because I always let it. I picked up the communication device and called my sister Claire. She answered on the 3rd chime. She was in her classroom after hours, stacking books on a shelf. She looked tired in the comfortable way that people look tired when they have done something useful with their day. Behind her, I could see a wall display with Velhari mathematical notation alongside the standard Earth curriculum. Her students were learning it as a second system. It was more efficient for certain kinds of spatial reasoning. The Velhari had shared it openly, freely, with no conditions. Marcus, she said, smiling, you look terrible. Thanks, Claire. Are you eating? Yes. Something that is actually food. I looked at the tin. Broadly, I said. She laughed. She sat down on the edge of her desk. How are things out there? Fine, I said. She looked at me the way only people who have known you your whole life can look at you. The way that goes directly past the word you just said and lands on the thing underneath it. Marcus, she said. I cannot tell you the specifics, I said. I know you cannot, she said. Are you okay? I thought about the 31 memorial addresses. I thought about the 943 crew of the 11 ships and the thousands after them, and the template I kept in my system and used every time because the truth was too honest for a public address. I thought about the box and the nice things inside it and the lid that would close behind us if we stepped in. I will be, I said. She nodded. She did not push. That was the thing about Claire. She knew when the most useful thing she could do was not push. The kids are doing well, she said. Fatima figured out the Velhari spatial sequence in about 15 minutes and then sat there looking bored for the rest of the class. I laughed, actually laughed. It surprised me. That sounds about right, I said. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing consequential. The school, her neighbor's garden, a film she had watched and found deeply confusing. I did not mention the communication. I did not mention the box. I did not explain what I was sitting with because the explanation would have required context that would have taken an hour and still not conveyed the actual weight of it. When we signed off, she said, "Come home when you can." "I will," I said. "I mean soon," she said. "Not politically soon, actual soon." "Understood," I said. I sat with the communication for another hour. Then I turned off the light in the compartment and did not sleep, which was normal, and thought about what it meant to choose a definition versus have one assigned to you, which was the question that had been underneath everything for 3 years. In the morning, I picked up a pen, an actual pen, not a stylus. Claire had sent it in a supply package 4 months earlier from the school in Dearborn. The kind of cheap plastic pen with a logo on the side that schoolchildren chewed on. The cap had teeth marks in it that were not mine. I held it for a moment. Then I put it back down and went to the briefing, because the 48 hours was not up yet, and the problem with decisions was that you had to be sure, and I was not sure yet, and the war did not pause for any of it. The final campaign began on a morning that had no quality to distinguish it from the 109 mornings before it. I had stopped marking mornings by quality a long time ago. The Rathka Deep System stronghold had been located 6 weeks prior through a combination of conquered sensor data and a navigational pattern analysis that Yara's intelligence team had been running for 8 months. The location was not a planet, not a station. It was a region of dense space, an area of overlapping gravitational fields from 3 closely orbiting bodies, the kind of location that made conventional navigation difficult, and that every conquered strategic model had identified as ideal for a command presence if you were a species that did not think the way other species thought. The Rathka had been there a long time, before the Pelori system, before we knew they existed, watching in the way that things watch when they have no interest in being seen. I was on the Mackind. Yara was on her command vessel, the Alderton, which was not named after anything heroic. It was named after a small river in a county in England that she had grown up near, which I had learned from her file and never mentioned because she had not told me voluntarily, and I respected the distance between knowing something about a person and using it. The fleet was assembled at the edge of the Deep System Zone, human ships in formation, conquered allies positioned at the supporting margins, not because they were lesser, but because the approach required the specific kind of tolerance for incoming damage that we had spent 3 years demonstrating. Elder was aboard the Mackind. She had asked to observe. I had said yes. I had not asked Yara first, which was technically outside my authority, but I had understood that Yara would not object, and she had not. Elder stood at the observation station on the command deck and said nothing. She had not spoken since we reached the assembly point. The bioluminescence along her jaw was doing the shifting thing I had first seen in the chamber on Theta Station the day she made the request, the thing that could not settle. Yara's voice came through the feed. "All units, formation confirmed, hold for signal." Silence on the command deck. 12 people doing their jobs with the specific focused quiet of people who have done their jobs under fire enough times that the focus has become automatic. The Rathka signals from within the Deep System Zone were dense, layered. They were not passive. They knew we were there. They had known for at least 40 minutes based on the signal shift patterns. They were deciding something. Yara's voice. "They're moving to intercept. All units on my mark." More silence. "Pushing." The fleet moved. I will not pretend that I have the vocabulary to fully describe what a fleet engagement looks like from a command deck feed when you are not a military person, and you have been watching them for 3 years, and they have still not become ordinary to you. What I can tell you is that it was loud in a way that was mostly data, numbers cascading across screens. Position updates and damage reports and status confirmations arriving in a continuous stream that the crew processed with an efficiency that looked like calm and was not calm at all, but was something more disciplined than calm. The Rathka came out of the deep system zone in a formation that was not a formation. They moved in mass, dense, overlapping, designed to overwhelm through sheer presence. Yara had expected this. The human fleet did not hold position. It opened, two wings pulling away from the center, drawing the Rathka mass through a gap that looked like a vulnerability and was a mechanism. The conquered allies at the margins activated the containment arc 3 seconds after the Rathka committed to the center advance. The gap closed. What followed was 12 hours of the kind of engagement that I have no interest in making sound dramatic, because it was not dramatic in the way that stories make things dramatic. It was grinding. It was relentless. Ships hit, ships responding, ships gone, ships pressing forward because the direction forward was the only direction available, and because Yara had built a fleet that understood the difference between a situation that required stopping and a situation that required continuing, and had calibrated their people to know which one this was. This was the continuing kind. I watched the feed. I handled the communication channels between Yara's command and the conquered allies. I managed 3 diplomatic inquiries from the conquered Security Council, asking for status updates, which I answered with the minimum necessary information in the most neutral language I could construct, because the Council had a tendency to begin discussing the post-conflict structure during conflicts, and I had no patience for that today. Elder stood at the observation station and watched. She did not speak. At the 9-hour mark, the Rathka deep system signals began changing. Yara flagged it. Her intelligence team flagged it. I flagged it from my communication feed because it was impossible to miss. The Rathka were not regrouping. They were not reconfiguring their tactical approach. The signal pattern was something the Concord's linguist team had never encountered from them before, and the team lead sent me a message at the 9-hour and 12-minute mark that I read and read again, and then forwarded to Yara. Yara's voice 2 minutes later. Hold. Not ceasefire, not retreat. Hold, maintain position, stop advancing. The fleet held. The Rathka signals continued. The linguist team lead's message had been 4 sentences. The last one was the one I kept reading. It's a morning frequency. They're not asking for negotiation. They're asking us to stop because they understand, for the first time, that we will not stop on our own. I thought about that sentence for a long time. The Rathka had crossed the Concord's outer boundary and erased a civilization of 17 billion people without sending a signal first. They had not negotiated. They had not communicated. They had operated on the assumption, which appeared to have been an accurate one based on everything that had come before us, that nothing they encountered would make them stop by choice. They had never encountered something that made stopping into a choice that required choosing. They had not known we would stop. That sentence was the whole thing. That was the center of it. I opened a channel to Yara. They're asking us to stop, I said. I heard, she said. We stop, I said. A pause, a short one. Yara's pauses were always calibrated. The council is not going to like that, she said. The council is not out here, I said. Another pause. Understood, she said. The fleet held position. The conquered allies, following Yara's signal and whatever they had made of the Rathka frequency, held as well. The conquered Security Council communication channel lit up with 6 simultaneous requests for explanation in as many languages. I set the channel to queue and did not answer it for 47 minutes. At the 47-minute mark, the Rathka signals shifted again. The linguist team had been working continuously. The lead sent a second message. They are acknowledging the hold. They are asking why. I thought about how to answer that in a way that would translate. I drafted 3 responses and deleted them. Too long, too formal, too full of context that was going to get lost. I drafted a 4th. Because we choose to. The lead sent it through the translation array on the frequency the Rathka had been using. The response took 11 minutes. The lead's message: they don't have a framework for that. They're asking us to explain choose. I sat with that for a moment. Then I sent back, that's the explanation. Keep sending it until they understand it. The ceasefire held. Elder came to the Macan 3 days after the fleet returned to Theta Station for resupply and repair assessment. She came without protocol, without entourage, in the direct way that she had occasionally done things across the 12 years I had known her, the way that bypassed all the formal structures and went straight to the thing itself. She stood in my office compartment. The pen Claire had sent me was on the desk. The martial arm designation document was beside it, unsigned, where it had been for 6 days. She looked at me for a long time. The bioluminescence along her jaw was brighter than I had ever seen it, steady, not shifting. In 2041, she said, we saved your people because it was the right thing to do. I know, I said. We did not save you because of what you would become. I know that too. We did not know, she said, what you would become. None of us did, I said. She reached out. I had spent 12 years documenting the fact that Veilhari did not initiate physical contact. Every xenosociological study, every field note, every diplomatic training module confirmed it. It was one of the most stable behavioral facts in the Concord's cultural database. She put her hand on my arm. Her hand was warm. I had not expected that. The debt, she said, was never the point. She left. I sat in the compartment. The designation document was on the desk. The pen was beside it. I picked up the pen, the cheap one from Claire's school with the teeth marks on the cap that were not mine, and I opened the document to the cover page where the Concord Security Council seal was printed and the signature line waited. I read the title one more time. Martial Arm, Permanent Designation, Humanity. I uncapped the pen. I wrote one word across the cover page. No. Not a statement about what we had done. Not a rejection of the people we had lost or the price that had been paid or the 12 hours of engagement at the edge of the deep system zone or the 32 memorial addresses or the template I kept in my system. Not a claim that any of it had been wrong. Just a refusal to let a function become a definition. Just a choice. I capped the pen, set it down. The document sat there with that single word across its cover, and I looked at it for a moment, and then I went to find Yara. She was in the galley, eating something from a tin, which was so consistent that I had begun to wonder if she had a private supply she was not disclosing. She looked up when I came in. The document, I said. Yes. I answered it. She looked at me, read the answer from my face. And now, she said. Now I was going to see if you wanted coffee, I said. She looked at the tin, looked at me. Is it warm? She said. No, I said. Understood, she said. Which meant yes. We sat in the galley with terrible cold coffee and a tin of whatever she was eating, and outside the Macan's hull, Theta Station was doing what it always did, which was existing at the intersection of 23 civilizations going about the business of being alive. And somewhere in the deep system zone, the Rathka were sitting with a word they did not have a framework for. And somewhere in Dearborn, a classroom full of children were learning Veilhari mathematics alongside their own. And the biosphere on Earth was still healing, slowly, the way things heal when they have been given time and care and rope when they were drowning. They saved us once. We came back with fire and everything we had, and we fought in the way that only we knew how to fight, and we stopped when stopping was the harder thing to choose, and we handed back something that the galaxy had forgotten it was missing. I do not know what happens next. Nobody does. The Rathka are still out there, learning what choose means, and the Conquered is still figuring out what humanity is if we are not their blade, and I still have a report due that has been overdue since before any of this started. Hell of a thing. You're welcome.